Let me read the section about Hitler that you allude to, Congressman. Quote, former generals who have worked for Donald Trump say that the sole military virtue he prizes is obedience. As his presidency drew to a close and in the years since, he has become more and more interested in the advantages of dictatorship and the absolute control over the military that he believes it would deliver. Quote, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had, Trump said in a private conversation in the White House, according to two people who heard him say that. People who were totally loyal to him, that follow orders. When you hear Trump's campaign rhetoric, what orders do you think he has in mind?
Well, you know, it's worth remembering that military officers also take an oath to the Constitution. And I do believe that the vast majority of them understand that their oath is to the Constitution of the United States, not to be obedient to anyone. And by the way, if you want to go back to World War II metaphors, any military officers who are wavering might read up on the story of the Nuremberg trials, in which I was just following orders was the kind of defense that led to the gallows. But look, we know what motivates Trump. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing but self-aggrandizement. So in any given moment, whatever Trump thinks is in that moment, advantageous thing, he will order flag officers to do. And again, flag officers would be well reminded, and I don't think they need this reminder, that their oath is to the Constitution of the United States and to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not to any one individual.
Let me dig back into this reporting with you, Miles Taylor. This is a deeply reported story about the tragic murder of a member of the military and Donald Trump's offer to pay for the funeral. Let me pick up the reporting where they are reporting out the process of the funeral bill showing up at the White House. Quote, according to a person close to Trump at the time, the president was agitated by McCarthy, the Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy's comments. He blamed leadership failures at Fort Hood. Trump was agitated by that. He raised questions about the severity of the punishments dispensed to senior officers and non-commissioned officers. In an Oval Office meeting on December 4th, 2020, officials gathered to discuss a separate national security issue. Toward the end of the discussion, Trump asked for an update on the McCarthy investigation. Christopher Miller, the acting Secretary of Defense, Trump had fired his predecessor, Mark Esper, 3 weeks earlier. Writing in a tweet, Mark Esper has been terminated, was in attendance, along with Miller's chief of staff, Kash Patel. At a certain point, according to two people present at the meeting, Trump asked, quote, did they bill us for the funeral? What did it cost? According to attendees and to contemporaneous notes of the meeting taken by a participant, an aide answered, yes, we received a bill. The funeral cost $60,000. Trump became angry. It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a bleeping Mexican. He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order, quote, don't pay it. Later that day, he was still agitated. Quote, can you believe it, he said, according to a witness, effing people trying to rip me off, end quote. Miles, we've talked a lot for 4 years now about where the generals are. It appears between the Woodward book and Jeffrey Goldberg's new piece of reporting, they're right in front of us. Somehow, some of these stories about his disdain for the military are reaching the public through journalism.
Well, and I would say, Nicole, there's some words you said a few times there that we should focus on. Contemporaneous notes. Now, I don't know who Jeffrey Goldberg's sources were, but the reason I don't doubt this reporting is I was one of those people taking contemporaneous notes in those meetings. And why? Because generals like Jim Mattis and John Kelly and Mark Milley went into those meetings. They told their aides like me, you need to document conversations with the president. Why? Not because they were looking to defy lawful orders, but because when you went into that Oval Office, you were worried you were going to get illegal orders or you were going to witness corruption. And it was happening so frequently that people were sitting in these meetings and writing word for word what the president was saying to make sure they got it right after the fact. That seems to be the case here. And the things that were said are not extraordinary. That's exactly what a meeting with Donald Trump sounds like, especially when it comes to members of the military. And I hate to say it, Nicole, but his disposition towards members of the military was that they were toy soldiers. And if they didn't comply with his orders, he didn't want them there. And that's why he fired or pushed aside so many defense and national security officials during his tenure, is that they weren't doing what he wanted to do when it came to nuclear conflicts or illegal orders to shoot people in the legs at the border, or to deem migrants as unlawful enemy combatants, as terrorists. Or again, Nicole, when I was there, he wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act to conduct activities that our lawyers thought would be illegal at the border. That's the type of thing that will test the oaths of our service members if Donald Trump wins a second term.
Miles, you worked for General John Kelly. He is quoted in Jeffrey Goldberg's new piece. Let me read from that section. Quote, in their book, The Divider, Donald Trump in the White House, Peter Baker and Susan Glasser report that Trump asked John Kelly, his chief of staff at the time, quote, why can't you be like the German generals? Trump at various points had grown frustrated with military officials he deemed disloyal and disobedient. Throughout the course of his presidency, Trump referred to flag officers as, quote, my generals. According to Baker and Glasser, Kelly explained to Trump that German generals tried to kill Hitler 3 times and almost pulled it off. This correction did not move Trump to reconsider his view. No, no, no. They were totally loyal to him, Trump responded. Quote, this week I asked John Kelly about their exchange. He told me that when Trump raised the subject of German generals, Kelly responded by asking, do you mean Bismarck's generals? He went on, I knew he didn't know who Bismarck was or about the Franco-Prussian War. I said, do you mean the Kaiser's generals? Surely you can't mean Hitler's generals. And he said, yeah, Hitler's generals. I explained to him that Rommel had to commit suicide after taking part in a plot against Hitler. Kelly told me Trump was not acquainted with Rommel. It is the collision of ignorance, the corruption of a soul to disdain men and women who give to something larger of themselves, the inability to grasp the concept, even if you haven't served in the military. Most people who haven't served revere those who have. Say more about General Kelly's education about who Donald Trump is.
Well, first I'll say he's the most honorable person that I've ever worked for. John Kelly has more integrity in his pinky finger than Donald Trump has in his whole body or has demonstrated in his entire career. And Kelly was very, very clear-eyed about who Donald Trump was. But he wasn't going to leave the administration after his first exposure to the man. He wanted to try to see if there was a way to keep that ship stable. Now, of course, we all know how that ended, as Trump in the end gets rid of anyone who tries to contain his worst impulses. But I think there was extraordinary alarm from the generals in what they saw in the president, and not just the immediacy of his impulsive behavior, but what that behavior looked like in the context of history. You don't have to listen to hyperbole about people saying Donald Trump looks like the dictators of the past. Look at his own language. Look at the language of his running mate. It's his running mate that called him America's Hitler. It's Donald Trump himself who has repeatedly lauded the worst dictator in the 20th century and compared his desires to that man. Take him at his word. That would be my exhortation to the American people as they go out to vote.
Claire McCaskill, I'll read more from this brand new piece of reporting in The Atlantic. Quote, this wasn't the only time Kelly felt compelled to instruct Trump on military history. In 2018, Trump asked Kelly to explain who the good guys were in World War I. Kelly responded by explaining a simple rule. Presidents should, as a matter of politics and policy, remember that the good guys in any given conflict are the countries allied with the United States. Despite Trump's lack of historical knowledge, he had been on record as saying that he knew more than his generals did about warfare. He told 60 Minutes in 2018 that he knew more about NATO than James Mattis, his Secretary of Defense at the time, a retired 4-star Marine general who had served as a NATO official. Trump also said on a separate occasion that it was he, not Mattis, who had captured the Islamic State. Your reaction, Claire, to this reporting?
Well, first, let me also say a word about John Kelly. I worked with John Kelly as the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee when he was the Secretary of Homeland Security. I knew him before that as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as I knew Jim Mattis. These people don't lie, and they don't respect people who do. And I believe John Kelly went to work for Donald Trump because he thought he was doing a service for his country. He thought he would protect the country from Trump's worst instincts. He left when he realized he couldn't, especially when he grasped how much disdain Donald Trump had for the members of the military who served. And remember, John Kelly's son was killed in combat. So when John Kelly says this happened, I guarantee you it happened. Absolutely. And the other thing to remember about this is what they're doing in this Atlantic piece is with thorough reporting, they're pulling a thread from the very beginning when he shocked us all by looking down his nose at John McCain for being a prisoner of war, all the way through his presidency, when he would not embrace those who had been wounded in war, would not risk his hairdo for visiting those who had sacrificed, made the ultimate sacrifice for the world's freedom. So this is a consistency that Donald Trump has had. So they can, Kash Patel and those idiots can lie all they want to about what he said. The other important thing to remember about this story, Nicole, is when he promised the family he would take care of their funeral expenses. That was before the election. That was in April of 2020, when he said, I'm not going to pay to bury the effing Mexican. That was after he had lost in December. So people need to remember, he'll say anything before an election, but his real true character comes out after the election.
And one